Hello, my name is Byron Bridges. You just saw two videotapes in which one shows a class discussion in ASL where visual aids in English are used, and the other was a person typing on a TTY while also signing ASL. Those are both examples where two languages are used, which is called bilingualism. Bilingualism is an interesting topic. Non-deaf people or hearing people define bilingualism as being able to skillfully transition between two languages. Now, let's see how that compares to the people of the deaf community's definition of bilingualism.
Bilingualism is when you are simultaneously skilled in English and American Sign Language.
Bilingualism means that people know two different languages. It can possibly depend on where someone has grown up. I have a few examples on how people can be bilingual. One example is that language between work and home could be different. It could also mean moving to a new place and learning a completely new language. However, they still use their original language at home, such as signing. Another example is when they may use different languages both at school and at home. My final example is if their parents are married and know two different languages, such as French or German, and with all of the language exposure, you have potential to learn these two different languages. Bilingualism is when you know two languages. For example, I have knowledge in Mexican Sign Language and American Sign Language. I'm skilled in both of these languages and able to switch easily between the two. Suppose if I were in America, I would use ASL, and if I were in Mexico, I would use MSL. If my relatives from Mexico came to visit me in America, I would communicate in MSL, and if my friends from America would visit me in Mexico, I would communicate in ASL. Those are my two languages.
I know two languages. I know how to sign in American Sign Language and how to read and write in English. I would use ASL when interacting with others, talking about topics such as politics. I would read in English, such as when I read the newspaper or when doing my homework or when watching TV with captions. I would use both of these languages with proficiency.
For me, bilingualism means that you can understand both English and American Sign Language. As a hearing interpreter, I can listen to English and interpret into American Sign Language, and I can see American Sign Language and interpret into English.
Wow, it is interesting to see the comparison between the deaf community and hearing community's definition of bilingualism. The deaf community describes it as knowing two languages, English and ASL, where the hearing community describes it as knowing any two spoken languages. It seems that both groups agree that bilingualism is being able to easily transition between two languages. Next, we will see each group describe how they learn to be bilingual.
I was born deaf in an all-hearing family, and I was fluent in English. I didn't know any sign language. I wrote and read and spoke English until I went to college at the age of 17 years old, where I was captivated by the deaf world and their language. I started to learn, and I was utterly consumed by it. It changed my world. Since then, for the past 10 years, American Sign Language has been an important tool for me that became part of my identity. It's part of who I am. Now I realize that I am fluent in two languages, English and ASL. I'm learning Italian Sign Language and Quebec Sign Language as well. Learning different languages is nice. I don't have just one language to rely on. I have access to a few different languages. It's cool.
What does bilingualism mean to me? I was born and grew up in Australia. The language we used was Auslan. Deaf people in Australia use Auslan Sign Language. My parents are deaf, and there are many deaf families all over Australia. Growing up, I had experienced a lot of Australian Sign Language, but was not exposed to a lot of English. I remembered learning how they work together, though. When I wanted something, my mom would tell me yes. Later, I went to my aunt's house and we discussed different languages. I wanted an apple, so I asked my aunt, and she fingerspelled Y-E-S. I was confused because I didn't know what Y-E-S meant. I asked if Y-E-S meant yes, and she said yes. So I continued to reach for the apple and made sure she meant I could eat it. She fingerspelled Y-E-S and then signed, meaning yes. And yes means Y-E-S. So I ate the apple and I started to slowly understand. Since then, I started to understand the difference between the two languages and how they work. Arriving to America, I started learning the sign language over here, American Sign Language. So far, I have learned 3 languages.
So how I learned 2 languages? Well, I was raised by 2 deaf parents and learned ASL as my primary language. I'd wave my little hands around signing. When it was time for me to go to school, I was very excited to see the other students similar to myself. I remember walking up to the classroom while holding my parents' hand, and the teacher came up to us and said hi. But they were signing and talking at the same time. I was watching and noticed that her signing was absolutely horrible, but I still understood. I looked around at the other students, and they were all talking and signing wildly, and they looked like animals. It shocked me. So later on, my teacher came up to me and very carefully trying to teach me English, but I needed to understand that I can't write word for word what I sign, being that it is 2 different languages. I need to follow along with what the teacher was writing on the board, even though it looked different than what I'm used to. Then, I'd go back home and probably show my family all the signs I learned in school that day. But they'd be shocked and say it's all wrong, saying that the signs I was showing them weren't natural ASL. So they'd correct me, and I'd make the changes at home, but when I was back at school, I'd change the signing they used there and communicate with everybody else. I grew up in Mexico where I used MSL. Then, when I was 8, I moved to America and attended a deaf school. When I'd fingerspell it to the teacher, I'd use an enya. The teacher informed me that an enya is only used in Mexico. And here, in America, we use an N. That was when I understood that they were 2 separate languages.
I remember learning my first language around the age of 3. Up to the age of 3, I had no language. It was hard to communicate with my parents. I remember around the age of 3, a deaf couple approached me. They noticed I was deaf and started signing to me. I didn't understand at first, but I quickly picked up on it. I would start signing and understanding more and more. I was learning different signs, like animals such as birds. I was able to identify them and understand that the signs are related to the animal. During preschool, I was in a deaf program. In the program, I was exposed to English. They would show us a picture that represented a word. I had a tough time learning the alphabet, though. In the classroom, we would use English, but outside playing, we would use ASL. I would go back and forth between the 2 languages with ease.
I grew up speaking and listening to English. Then, suddenly, at the age of 18 or 19 years old, I came across a sign language course and it drew my interest, so I started to sign little by little, and then later I took another course, and then another, and I really started to improve. 2 or 3 years ago, I became a certified interpreter, and I continue to learn. Now, I'm fairly proficient in American Sign Language.
Well, that was interesting to see how both the deaf community and hearing community became bilingual. Hearing people learn languages by listening, and deaf people learn languages visually. The 2 groups have different descriptions of their experiences growing up. Now let's see how both groups use bilingualism in their everyday lives. Let's watch and find out how deaf people use bilingualism on a daily basis.
I use my bilingualism naturally every day. I wake up every morning, I read the newspaper in English, and often I'll see something interesting and I'll discuss it with my roommate in American Sign Language. In class, I'll read and write English and discuss in American Sign Language. We don't spell out words to each other. It's more natural to use ASL. Every day, I'm able to make use of the two languages we know.
I use two languages every day. For example, I grew up in Australia, and deaf people there use Auslan Sign Language and TTYs. While using the TTY, I communicate by typing English, and my message goes to whoever I'm communicating with, who understands how to read and write English. Deaf people in Australia use Auslan Sign Language and move back and forth between reading and writing with the two languages. Let's say in America, I become skilled in the three languages and learn how to transition between the three. I practice by reading and writing in the newspaper in English. And also, if my friends from Australia came to visit me here, I would use Auslan Sign Language to interpret for them so they can understand the deaf friends here in America. So, if my friends want to talk to a deaf person who uses American Sign Language, I would use American Sign Language to talk to the American deaf person, and then Australian Sign Language to talk to my Australian deaf friend. I would interpret both, going back and forth between the two languages smoothly.
I use bilingualism every day. For example, when my friends and I would watch television, I'd read the captions on the bottom of the screen. I'd understand the English captions with no issue, whereas my friends would sometimes get confused on what was happening with the captions and get lost and embarrassed. They'd ask me to explain what the captions meant, and I'd explain using ASL while reading and comprehending the captions at the same time, so I've experienced both of these languages. Yes, I use two languages every day. For example, in class, when the teacher would hand out assignments that is in English, and I'm unsure what the assignment is, my classmates and I get together in a group and discuss the assignment in ASL until we understood the assignment, then go back to the computer and put it back into English.
I use bilingualism every day. I went to a restaurant with my friends. We sat down and read the menu, trying to decide what we wanted to eat. I asked my friends in ASL what they would want to eat. Then I finally decided on something and pointed to what I wanted on the menu for the waiter to see. If the waiter didn't understand, I would write it down in English and show the waiter. This is how I use bilingualism.
Before, when I used to teach English to deaf students, I would explain and write it on the board in English, and if they weren't understanding it, I would explain in American Sign Language until they understood. They could see the English and match it to what I explained in American Sign Language, but keep the languages separate so it would improve both their ASL and English fluency.
You just saw how hearing people and deaf people use language differently. Hearing people can speak on the phone and transition between two languages orally. The deaf community is different. Deaf people will use English in its written form through a TTY or closed captions, but for face-to-face communications, they will use ASL. Those videos clearly showed how differently both groups use bilingualism. But it was also shown that both groups are talented bilingualists. Next, we will watch the people you just saw using ASL using other sign languages that they know. Oh, hello again. That was truly fascinating. We hope you learned more about bilingualism from the people in these videos. The people who were involved in putting these videos together hope that people understand just how important bilingualism is. Some parents and school administrators may have some concerns about whether bilingualism is a benefit for deaf children. We are seeing that deaf people can certainly master 2 to 3 or even 4 languages. We want to encourage more parents of deaf children to learn more languages and help support the movement of bilingualism. We hope that you are willing to support this idea. Thank you very much.